think it said the 10 times time. Wow. I 10 weeks. That verse, it's capitalising on it. Keep this public meeting on it.
So the first question is, why do you feel it's important for people to be here today in the demo?
Well, I think we have got the right in this country to raise our voices and protest or speak out when the world's practically on the precipice. And I think it's important people come here today and make their feelings known, because disappointingly I don't think anyone in government is listening, not only in this country but across Europe or NATO or the US. And I think we, the people, we need to speak up and make ourselves heard and make that difference.
Okay, thanks. I presume you're too young to have been during the Iraq demo in 2003.
That's very kind of you. Well, I'm an ex-soldier. I was in the Iraq War.
Were you really?
I was, yeah. I was in all of Tony Blair's campaigns, and being a veteran now, the scales fall from your eyes, and I have a bit more of a clear view on who the real enemy is. So, dare I say, it's our political leadership.
Okay, so what do you think of the Labour Party, in effect, banning its MPs and maybe its members as well from supporting Stop the War and attending this march?
Well, I think that's a disgrace. I think everybody in this country should have the right to speak out in a manner they feel is right on the issues which they feel strongly about. And this is, besides the environment catastrophe, this is humanity on the precipice, and we need to speak, and people shouldn't be gagged.
Okay. And my last question is, do you have any thoughts about the future for Labour, the left, and the anti-war movement? I mean, I don't know if you consider yourself to be on the left, but what are your thoughts about the whole future direction?
Well, I think we need to get more to the left, is my sort of principal feeling, and I'm not very confident that that is going to be the state of things in the future. Hopefully we have a future, a far future, and I think there's more to be done to get us away from the right. Our departure from the European Union, I think, has emboldened Putin. I think this whole crisis is absolutely our fault in the West and NATO. Not perhaps in absolute terms, but Putin has taken advantage of that. He's leveraged that fractured state in Europe, and it's a parlous state that we're in this country, and I just hope it improves, and I hope we can pull away from the right.
So were you in Iraq? How long were you in Iraq for? Just that last question. Sorry.
So I did 24 years as a soldier in the Royal Army Medical Corps.
Wow.
I was a non-combatant. I did 3 tours of Afghanistan and 1 tour of Iraq. So did some time overseas, campaigning during the campaign era, for Imperial Britain, effectively, and clearly I have some strong views about that.
Yeah. We won't go into all of them, but thank you so much for your participation and your answers. It's great.
Well, thanks for hearing me.
Yeah. So Alex, why do you feel it's important for people to be here today?
Well, I think over the past few years particularly, there's been a particular U-turn when it comes to nuclear weapons. I think particularly how the British government itself has basically done a U-turn, how they were committed to partial disarmament and now increasing the stockpile. We're also seeing the US, Russia, China invest in hypersonic technology, and obviously with the disaster in Ukraine happening, and now we have NATO pushing further east and it's more likely to occur.
Yeah, right. And what do you think about, Alex, what do you think about the Labour Party in effect banning its MPs from supporting Stop the War CND and attending this march?
I disagree with it. I think, as MPs, even if it's not in the mainline party direction, they have a right to do that. That's the point of having opposition in Parliament. Without opposition, then we might as well be in a one-party state.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And do you have any thoughts about the future for Labour, the left and the anti-war movement?
Well, I think for the left and Labour, it's been a massive setback since Keir Starmer has become leader. You know, I was never fully on board with Corbyn. I thought we needed someone stronger, but the left at the moment is nothing really in this country. I think it's abysmal.
I suppose you're too young to remember the Iraq War. How old were you when, in
Oh,
2003, when they had the two?
I was 2 years old. So yeah, I was very young.
Do you see any sort of equivalence between what we did in 2003 to Iraq and Afghanistan and what's happening now? You know?
Well, yeah, I think it's countries as excuses, like the whole WMD thing. It's also the same, I think, with Ukraine. Like, you know, I've always said, like, certain regions in Ukraine, if they hold democratic, legitimate elections, to join Russia, but this whole excuse of going in there for peacekeeping reasons, it's very reminiscent of Iraq, I think.
Yeah.
And also, I believe in nations' right to self-determination, that no other country should bully them. But
Thanks very much. So first question is, why do you feel it's important for people to be here today?
I think to stand up to stand up to a horrendous dictator, bully, just to show defiance against that.
Yeah, I think, and I agree with that. I think it's just, you know, it's just terrible to know what he's doing in Ukraine at the moment, and how the propaganda and everything over in Russia. All the Russians,
the propaganda?
well, all the people in Russia. I mean, a friend of mine, for instance, I bumped into yesterday. His wife's Russian, and she's trying to speak to all her family and friends over there, and they're all, you know, don't think there's a war going on at the moment. A lot of them, and they just think that, you know, that all the fuss is about. So it's just terrible to think that those people believe that.
Yeah. I might be a bit presumptuous, but I'm just wondering whether either of you were involved in the demonstration against the Iraq War, and what you think about what happened then in 2003, and the false propaganda, the fake news about weapons of mass destruction, and now.
Yeah. I didn't really get involved in that. I mean, it was just as terrible things were happening out there as there are now. I think probably for me it's because I've got, you know, grandchildren now, and I just think of the world that they're going to grow up in is it's just a terrible place, you know, with all what's happening. So it's very similar though. You're still dealing with a dictator, aren't you, really, out there?
I wasn't involved in demonstrating with that either. I think you look at technology now and how different it is from 2003, and the information that we have access to now that dog's probably making more sense than I am, to be honest. But yeah, I think we know a lot more now, and obviously with that comes fake news also. But you know, you make your own judgments, don't you?
And last question is, do you have any thoughts about, I don't know if you'd call yourself on the left, but do you have any thoughts about the future for Labour, the left and the anti-war movement, based on what's happening now?
Well, I just hope they all come together, really, and there is, you know, whether they're Labour, Liberal or Conservative. I think, you know,
something we've all got to work together on. Yeah, there's not a time for
picking sides.
Yeah,
I don't think, really.
Yeah. We need. It's got to be a team effort against this man, hasn't it?
And you don't think NATO has any responsibility towards what's happening now?
So that's a really difficult one, because I think, you know, I mean, I feel for the people out there, and they obviously want us to send in troops and take more of a, you know, an armed responsibility. But the danger is if we do that, then of course we could trigger off. It's just, we're not dealing with anybody that makes any sense, really. So that's a scary thing, is that it may not stop with what he's doing now. And I suppose if we get involved in NATO, then NATO gets involved. Sorry.
We've just come from South London, not far to come.
All right, but you're not a South London.
No, I'm from Yorkshire. I'm from up north.
My wife's from Yorkshire as well. So I mean, why do you think it's important for people to be here today?
Well, we've come to show our support for Ukraine and for all the Ukrainian people.
Yeah.
We disagree with the war, so we hope that some of the Russian influenced people might get to see this and realise that there's mass opposition to it across the whole globe, not just here in London but everywhere.
Yeah, but I see you've got, it says Russian troops out, no NATO expansion. Do you agree with that?
Not especially. I don't know enough about it, to be honest, but we want the war to stop, and we want Ukraine to feel supported by the rest of Europe.
Right, okay. So, but you don't have a feeling about NATO's expansion into to the Russian border and having missiles pointed at Russia from Poland and stuff?
Well, we don't agree with war in any respect, so if the result of NATO moving into Ukraine is the result of missiles pointing at Russia, then we're not in support of that.
I mean, I don't know if you consider yourself to be on the left, you know, politically, but what do you think of the Labour Party, in effect, banning its MPs from supporting Stop the War and attending this march even?
I'm sorry, what have we do support the Labour Party, what have they done?
What do you think of the Labour Party, in effect, banning its MPs from supporting Stop the War and attending this march?
I don't agree with that. They should bring back Jeremy Corbyn. I don't think he'd be banning people attending protests. So we support Labour and we vote Labour. Fortunately, we've got a very good Labour MP in South London, but I didn't know they were doing that, so I don't support that, no.
Who's your Labour MP?
I'm Ellie Reeves.
Okay, right, okay. And do you have any thoughts about the future for Labour, the left, and the anti-war movement based on what's happening at the moment?
I'm very worried about the future for Labour. I just think there's a lot of in-party fighting and they're not creating a positive or credible opposition to the Tories. And we want the Tories out. We didn't vote for the Tories. We voted for Ellie Reeves, who's awesome. So yeah, I wish the Labour Party would get themselves together.
Yeah, okay.
Why are you here?
Because we want to support Ukraine in because they can't really do much about it. Yeah.
That's good, Freddie. Yeah, well done. Do you want to say anything, Abby?
My name is Jim Curran.
Jim?
Yeah.
Well, Jim, why do you feel it's important for people to be here today?
Well, I feel it's important for people here today, people who oppose war or who oppose imperialism or occupation. But I think that there's far too much emphasis on Ukraine. And the major occupation issue that I see is Palestine. And even last year in Palestine, 77 Palestinian children were killed by Israelis. And the people who are expressing major concern about what's happening now in Ukraine are virtually ignoring that. They're ignoring sanctions. And I do not agree with what's happening in Ukraine. I think that Putin should not have sent in any soldiers into Ukraine. So that is one of the tragedies of imperialism.
Jim, I notice you've got Ireland on your side, and I know you're Irish.
Yes.
Why is that? Can you explain that for me?
Yes, well, Ireland is the oldest occupied nation in the world. And in 1918, Sinn Féin won the Irish general election. On the 19th of January 1919, they assembled in the Mansion House in Dublin. They declared independence. They elected a president, and once they declared independence, that established the sovereignty of the Irish nation. So no British political party or no British monarch has any right to put forward the imperial lie that part of Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. And in successive elections from 1886 onward until 1918, the Irish people voted 4 times for Home Rule, a majority of people on the whole island.
Right. What its MPs from supporting Stop the War today and attending this?
Well, I think it's quite disgraceful, but it's the same disgraceful thing that the Labour government previously did in relation to Sinn Féin. They would not allow Sinn Féin representatives to come on to the thing. And the BBC here beside me, they ban people from Sinn Féin. They wouldn't allow them on to any of their programmes. So it's nothing new. The Labour Party has a long record in this. The Labour Party were in power when Sinn Féin was banned from the British Airways. So it's not, to me, it is nothing new. And they say that they believe in free speech. Well, if they believe in free speech, they should allow all of their MPs and all of the members to say what they like. I do not believe that people should libel people or they shouldn't slander people, but coming out with political criticism, I think it's totally valid.
Jim, one last question. Do you have any thoughts about the future for Labour, the left, and the anti-war movement?
Well, I think that they have no other choice only to continue. They have no other choice only to continue. And sometimes people who are campaigning for things. Hello, Mum! Sometimes when people are campaigning for things, they can suffer, we'll say, I suppose, political defeat nearly. But if we look at Sinn Féin in Ireland, come under much more criticism than Stop the War Coalition or the people in the Labour Party. But they kept on going, and eventually then they abandoned the military campaign and concentrated on a peaceful, lawful, democratic campaign. And because these groups here in England are campaigning in a peaceful, lawful, democratic way, I believe they should carry on like Sinn Féin, because Sinn Féin now is the largest party in the occupied part of Ireland and in the free part of Ireland. So my message to the British left, the Stop the War Coalition, and those people in the Labour Party who are campaigning against imperialism is to keep campaigning in a peaceful, lawful, democratic way and damn the lot of them.
So firstly, could you say who you are?
I'm Kate Hudson. I'm General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament.
Okay, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. I mean, why do you feel it's important for people to be here today?
The particular messaging from CND, which we've been trying to get out desperately through the media and as widely as possible, is that with this conflict in Ukraine, we're at real risk of nuclear war. We're seeing the escalation. We absolutely condemn the invasion, the escalation, but the way that militarization is being increased on all sides, talk of a no-fly zone and so on, there's no doubt that such a development would lead to direct conflict between Russia and NATO states. And then you're talking about 12,000 nuclear weapons being on the table.
You mentioned NATO. I mean, do you think there's a sort of, balance between who sort of started this problem or what?
Well, the immediate situation is obviously because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which we absolutely condemn. If you want to look at the context of how this conflict has arisen, you have to look back 30 years at least. You have to look back to the end of the Soviet Union, the winding up of the Warsaw Pact, and NATO's decision, contrary to some of the things they said at the time actually, to expand NATO into Eastern Europe. And in fact, NATO has now gone global, and it's not even claiming to be a defensive organisation anymore. We've seen it 20 years at war in Afghanistan. So we have to include an understanding of that development, some of the former Soviet republics part of NATO. No way that excuses the war being perpetrated by Russia now, but if we need to understand the context, we have to do that in order to work out what kind of common security Europe can develop to deal with complex regional problems of this sort.
What do you think about the Labour Party in effect banning its MPs from supporting Stop the War probably see ending as well, and attending this march. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that they were prevented from speaking out against NATO, which I think is absolutely reprehensible. You know, NATO, Labour was part of founding NATO in the 1940s. We know that. We know that Labour has pro-NATO positions, pro-nuclear weapons positions, but throughout its life it has had debate and democratic discussion within the Labour Party, where good, strong democratic reasons for speaking out against these things have been part of the fabric of the Labour Party, and it seems that is no longer allowed. And to have a situation where there is a war going on, where elected representatives of the people are not allowed to say what they profoundly believe to be true, that is absolutely disgraceful. You know, we need free speech in this country now more than ever.
My last question is, do you have any thoughts about the future for Labour, the left, and the anti-war and anti-nuclear movement?
The one word that's just popped into my mind is unity. You know, we have to have unity on the basis of principles, and those principles must be of peace and justice and advancing the interests of all people. I fail to see how war, how killing can be any part of that. You know, who is dying in Ukraine? The ordinary people. Who are the main victims of war? The poor. We all know that. So we have to stick together, get together and understand, let's not kill other people. Let's not kill our brothers and sisters in other countries across the world.
Do you feel that the debate is sort of, there's been a lot of criticism of mainstream media recently, saying that these are white people, blonde hair, blue-eyed, middle class, they get Netflix on their, their television, whatever. Have you found that disturbing or what?
Very disturbing. You know, we are against all war. Every single human life is valuable, equally valuable. Every single human death is a tragedy. Full stop, full stop. So we've just got to get out there and support all people dying in any wars.
I'm Lindsay German, I'm the convener of the Stop the War Coalition.
Right. And why do you feel it's important for people to be here today?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. Firstly, obviously in solidarity with the people of Ukraine, in opposition to Putin's war, which I think is completely unjustified and he has to withdraw his troops straight away. But also, if we just look at it in those terms and don't look at the role of our own government and its allied government, then we're missing quite a big part of the context of this war. Because it didn't start 3 weeks ago, it didn't start with the build-up of troops on the border, it started decades ago with the end of the Cold War and the way that things have gone, particularly the expansion of NATO, which has been, whereas the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, nearly 30 years ago now, the same wasn't true of NATO, and NATO has added 14 European countries to its membership since then, and has expanded in all sorts of other areas, not least in aggressive wars against Afghanistan, Libya, and at certain stages in Iraq.
And what do you think of the Labour Party in effect banning its MPs from supporting Stop the War and attending this march?
I don't agree with it at all. I can understand the pressure they were under, but I think that it's a mistake, and I think that actually it's going to affect not just those MPs, but many, many Labour Party members who may want to come on the demo, who may speak out, and who may find themselves subject to discipline and maybe worse. So, as far as I'm concerned, Starmer has no right to demand of people that they can't criticise NATO. It's an absolutely astonishing demand. It's one which really is about the thought police. Are we saying seriously that MPs are not allowed to have their own opinion on this, particularly when we've been proved so right about these previous wars? And you'd think at the very least this should be something in a democracy that we're allowed to express and that MPs are allowed to express.
And just one last question, do you have any thoughts about the future for Labour, the left, and the anti-war movement,
Well, what I hope is that we can begin to rebuild the relationship that we've had. Let's be honest, it's always been the left MPs who've supported Stop the War. The right MPs have always been bitterly opposed to it, and one of the things, they're clearly very much in control of what happens in Starmer's Labour Party. And of course the Blairites have never forgiven us for the war, opposing the war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and with eventually Blair going, which was very much to do with his warmongering. So they want to re-establish the old Cold War Labour Party, and the majority of Labour MPs probably agree with them, and it's a shame on them really that they don't look at the reality, don't ever admit that they're wrong, and continue to support these wars against all the evidence that they shouldn't do.
Why should you? Yeah, and what should you? If they could vote such a shame that I haven't seen today. Catherine Alexander.
Oh, that woman. Yeah, I wouldn't remember her name. Yeah, that's right. She's in her work. Yeah, I she used the place where she did her Facebook. Yeah.
No, I did tell them. She said, oh, she was in Durham. I mean, I do understand to come all the way to London to go. That wasn't what we aimed to do.
I rang Janet just a quick call.
Yeah.
No, wrong. She rang me. I was going to call her. She rang me just after I put up the phone, and I said, look, I'm going today. Any chance you can join? I said tomorrow in theory. I said in theory. I'm meeting Victoria at 12 to 12 for the larger, for the march. And she's not at all.
Well, she's really tired of it.
It takes a huge toll on her.
It does.
And she deals with death every day. I mean, that's got to, make you depressed. For starters, and there's enough. I'm depressed. There's nothing to be depressed about. It's not that kind of unrelenting tragedy. Yeah. She says sometimes to her, I tell you,
Yeah, but maybe one doesn't want to live quite so.
Well, obviously, she doesn't. I didn't think I could, but I had no choice.
Yeah, but she does.
Yeah.
If I had a choice, I would just take it.
Oh, if I had a choice, I would.
It's understandable.
But anyway, I mean, until you get there, I mean, I've been to the whole thing, but I've been to this before. How can I not afford to get in? What's like there?
What are you affiliated with? You're independent.
Yeah, well, we're doing it for some new online TV channel called Red Line TV.
Ah, great.
There's one going on. It's more interesting.
So Russell, my first question is, why do you feel it's important for people to be here today?
Well, I think it's important to send a general message to the world that nobody wants war. And in fact, I guess the two slogans of this for this protest, which is troops out of Ukraine, but more importantly, no NATO expansion. And that's really why I am on this demonstration. Obviously, I abhor a lot of the images that are appearing on our screen about the war, but it's pretty much one-sided and pretty much biased. The mainstream media like the BBC fail to show the atrocities of the Ukrainian military and their various Azov battalion, right sector that are bombarding the Donbass and equally causing atrocities and casualties. And all of this could have even been avoided. They are already speaking now that Ukraine will agree to neutral status. This is what Russia was arguing all along. All of this could have been avoided if not for the hubris and exceptionalism of NATO and its US imperial masters.
What do you think about the Labour Party in effect banning its MPs from supporting Stop the War and attacking and attending this march?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to raise that in what I said. I am a Labour Party member, and it's a badge of honour to oppose NATO, which is the preeminent cause of this war. And it's an absolute disgrace that the leader of the Labour Party is now opportunistically trying to brandish his patriotism by wrapping himself in the British flag and the NATO flag. And it's an absolute shame. And I'm ashamed as a Labour Party member to be associated with such a stance.
Last question. Do you have any thoughts about the future for Labour, the left and the anti-war movement? What are your thoughts about that now?
Well, I think, firstly, I think with the current trajectory of the Labour Party, they're unlikely to win the next election. And the leadership needs to realize that it's the left of the Labour Party that primarily provides the feet and boots on the ground to campaign. And it's a terrible opportunistic gamble to adopt such draconian and authoritarian measures. I mean, speak about hypocrisy. The leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, was first out of the block to call for the banning of RT. In other words, the banning of free speech. And now we see where that's going. He's trying to ban free speech in the Labour Party. Unprecedented. What else can I say? I'm breathless. I'm shocked to hear what he's embarked on doing.
Thank you so much, Russell, for your contribution.
Thank you.
I think you hope you don't get recognised by any of your constituents.
That's fine. I will wear it as a badge of honour if they expel me.
I've left.
We don't want a nuclear war!
War, war!
War, war!
All over the country, southwest, north of
What do we want?
Peace.
Oh, long time.
Putin! Out, out, out! Putin! Out, out, out! Refugees in! Oligarchs out! Refugees in! Oligarchs out! Refugees in! Now! 1, 2, 3, 4! We don't want a nuclear war!
Ceasefire now before it's too late!
We don't want a nuclear war!
Ceasefire now before.
Stop the war! Stop the war!
And yesterday we discussed it in our National Education Executive, and we took the position that expansion of military alliances isn't the way out of this conflict. And the involvement of NATO or UK troops would be a dangerous escalation. So part of our movement, part of the role of our movement, is to stay the hand of our government. Boris Johnson's being very quiet at the moment because he's under pressure from some quarters. He's under pressure from some quarters to send in UK troops or to establish a UK police no-fly zone. Let's be clear, a no-fly zone isn't implemented by air traffic control. It's an act of war, it's an act of aggression. And so what we have to be saying in this movement is to stay the hand of our government and say we don't want no-fly zones. We don't want UK military forces involved in the Ukraine because that would be a dangerous escalation. So we want peace, and we want a negotiated peace. We may be small in number today, smaller than we've sometimes been used to, but this war is going to go on. This situation could go on for a long time, and we will have to come back here in even greater numbers to say stop the war, stop the invasion, no Russian troops out, no to NATO expansion, and no to UK military involvement in the Ukraine.
We're meeting at a moment of terrifying existential crisis, of nuclear war and climate emergency, which could annihilate all life. The war crimes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are in all our minds. The emotion of today's tide of desperate refugees and individual suffering is visible to us all. And here too are echoes of 2014's 93 days of violent street revolution in Kyiv, which dislodged a Russian-backed tyrant. Peace, as the other speakers have said, is the absolute priority. We have a worldwide peace movement, and this weekend must give it great new strength. Every day of this war, with its unmistakable nuclear threat and its massive fossil fuel consumption, intensifies those twin crises. In Britain, our military spending deepens the current shameful poverty, hunger, homelessness, which scar our country. Let's be honest, a military end to this war is unthinkable. The new Russian socialist anti-war movement wrote last week, quote, "This war will turn Ukraine into rubble and Russia into a prison. We've seen the beginning of both these forecasts. The war can only end in negotiations, a ceasefire, the withdrawal of Russian troops, and a settlement very different from the Treaty of Versailles, where the humiliation of one country led to the rise of a despotic mass murderer and World War II. History and Western arrogance are deep in today's story. This war has been in the making for 20 years. Successive US presidents withdrew from nuclear treaties, ratcheted up arms spending, including NATO, nuclear, installed 750 military bases across the world, including in Eastern Europe. NATO transformed from a defensive Cold War alliance to a post-Cold War alliance drawn into US wars in Afghanistan, in Libya, and above all in Serbia. And the West, including Britain, our leaders embraced the corrupt super-rich of the new Russia. In the future, there will be a new generation of leadership committed to peace and committed to guaranteed neutrality, like Ireland, Switzerland, Austria, and Vietnam. I want to finish with Vietnam, the epitome of war crimes and suffering. That failed 20-year American war has lessons, particularly for Russia's army commanders. It cost $1,000 billion. It failed to install a pro-US government. 3 million people were killed in Vietnam. The countryside and the forests were devastated by sheets of the defoliant poison, Agent Orange. And today, deformed babies, as a result, are still being born in Vietnam's village. The Vietnamese poet and Buddhist monk Nhat Hanh wrote this in 1967, when America had 400,000 troops in his country. Fires spring up like dragon's teeth at the 10 points of the universe. A furious, acrid wind sweeps them towards us from all sides. Aloof and beautiful, the mountains and the rivers abide. All around, the horizon burns with the color of death. As for me, I'm still alive, but my body and my soul in it writhe as if they too had been set afire. My parched eyes can shed no more tears. Thank you.
And we are wholly opposed to Russia's invasion into the Ukraine. We are wholly opposed to war. Black people have been fighting for peace for over 400 years. We've been fighting for peace and for justice for over 400 years. So I say again, Black Lives Matter is opposed to the Russian invasion into the Ukraine. But we also have to talk about the reality of what's happening in the Ukraine for black people. Yes, we do. I cannot stand here as an anti-racist activist and not call out the atrocity that is happening to African people at the borders of the Ukraine. When they said that people could leave the country, I didn't know they meant just white people. When they say Europeans are free to leave the country, what they mean is white Europeans. Is that right? Is that right? Do Black Lives Matter? We have seen the footage of black people being thrown off the trains in the Ukraine. That hurts to our very core. If we are to stand united against things like war, it's all of our races together. If a Ukrainian bleeds and I bleed, it's the same blood. We need solidarity and unity. When I see black train drivers in the Ukraine being thrown out and stopped at the border and not being allowed to travel, is that right? Is that right? Should we not be standing together in solidarity and unity? Listen, anybody in the Ukraine should be allowed to leave the country. Okay, I've heard senior people, senior politicians in the Ukraine, actually a senior prosecutor, he said it's so sad. It's so sad what's happening because the war is inflicted on, people like us with blonde hair and blue eyes. So that means it's okay to be inflicted with war if you're a black person. Is that right? Listen, this is my message to all of you. Black Lives Matter. If Black Lives Matter in the UK and if Black Lives Matter in the US, then Black Lives Matter in the Ukraine. Say it with me. Whose lives matter? Whose lives matter? Whose lives matter? Let our people board the trains. Solidarity.
Sorry about that. Okay.
Yeah, sure. First of all, let's thank Stop the War and CND for bringing us all together here in the name of peace. While some in the political establishment raise questions, the reality is Stop the War and CND have been a committed, unfaltering voice for peace for decades and decades. I was delighted that Bruce Kent mentioned my late friend and political mentor, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He said, as Bruce repeated, we ended apartheid in South Africa. He also said, we can end apartheid in Israel. He also said, we can end all war. We have to resolve the unacceptable situation in Ukraine, the unacceptable incursion by Putin's troops through diplomacy. And that has to include a guarantee of no NATO expansion. But unfortunately, our own government, the American government, most European governments, Russia and China, all see the world through a military mindset. And this is reflected in the reality that the US government, the country involved in more conflicts today than any other, has more people running one aircraft carrier than it has diplomats across the entire world. And today, the United States of America has 11 aircraft carriers in service. And this is not at all surprising when it is our political leaders and their political parties, our corporate leaders of the companies that produce the weapons of war, and our military leaders who benefit politically and materially from the trade in weapons, the most corrupt trade the world has ever seen. Who can forget that Tony Blair personally has made tens of millions of dollars for himself, directly and indirectly, out of the invasion of Iraq? A few weeks ago, the chief executive of Raytheon celebrated the instability in Eastern Europe, saying it would benefit his company and benefit his shareholders. Raytheon is sending more missiles and bombs to Yemen than any other company. Over 20,000 innocent civilians have been killed by our weapons in Yemen. As we demand an end to war in Ukraine, so we must demand an end to the wars that we are arming in Yemen and in Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shelley, and thanks to everybody for being here today. This is an incredibly important moment in the world. It's an incredibly important moment in world history, and it's so important that we all stand up and be counted against war. I'd like, first of all, to send my solidarity to the people of Ukraine. They are suffering the most brutal war in the most brutal conditions, and I want to make it very clear, Russian troops should get out now and there should be a ceasefire. I also would like to send my solidarity to the anti-war movement in Russia. These are incredibly brave people who are demonstrating against Putin and who are being arrested in large numbers. And they are saying to us in the rest of the world, Russians do not necessarily agree with what Putin is saying. And that is so important, the message coming from Russia. But it's also important, the message here, that we are absolutely clear, and there are 50 protests going on across Britain today alongside this win in London. There are hundreds more taking place across the world, and our immediate message is stop this war and get the Russian troops out. But we cannot just leave it there, because we know that our government, and I don't see how we can believe a single thing that Boris Johnson tells us about anything. We know that our government is looking at what is happening in Ukraine and is trying to use the suffering of people there, the terrible conditions, the way in which people are made refugees, the way in which they're cowering in bomb shelters, the way in which their cities are being shelled and are being evacuated. None of this can be justified in the slightest, but our government wants to pretend that it has never been involved in wars like this itself. And I would like to ask, where were they when Fallujah was besieged and beset with depleted uranium by the United States of America? There were no calls then to go to the International Criminal Court. I'm against cluster bombs. I'm against the kind of bombing of civilians that is going to go on in Ukraine. But I want to be absolutely clear, I'm against it wherever it happens and under whatever conditions it happens. I've been opposed to war all my life, and I remember the first war that I was opposed to was the Vietnam War. I feel the same sickness and horror today when I look at Ukraine and consider how awful it is. But this war did not start here. It started with the post-Cold War world, where we had the invasions we had the bombing of Serbia, we had the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, we had the bombing of Libya. All of these have helped to create the conditions, along with NATO expansion, where we find ourselves now. We have to have peace now, we have to have withdrawal now, and we have to have peace talks. And the anti-war movement is not going to take lessons from anybody in our government about how to fight for peace. Unlike them, we oppose all wars, not just the wars that are among their enemies. And therefore, we are also going to campaign against NATO enlargement and for a just peace for everybody in the world, for the people of Yemen as well as Ukraine, for the people of Palestine as well as Ukraine. These things matter and we have to bring them together. Final point I want to make is this. We have an anti-war movement in this country which is accused of being traitors, which is accused of being in support of Putin. We do not support Putin any more than we supported Saddam Hussein, any more than we've supported Milosevic or any of the others. We are here to say we are against the war, we are against what our government is doing, and we are not going to stop. Please join us next week when we'll have another day of action, and please do everything you can to build the movement and to put these ideas across, because we have to stop this war before it turns into a much, much bigger war. Thank you.
Been, even before Stop the War coalition was formed in 2001, many of us as individuals or part of other collectives have never favored the wars that have been fought, including Putin's wars. We oppose the assault on Ukraine, just like many of us, not too many, I add, opposed the war that Putin waged in Chechnya. Remember Chechnya? Well, that war was supported by the British government. That war in Chechnya was supported by the United States of America. The day after the capital of Chechnya, Grozny, was razed to the ground, Tony Blair flew to Moscow to congratulate Putin on his election victory. So we haven't just learned about this particular form of expansionism by the Russian government now. We learned it before, during the Chechen crisis. So we don't need any lessons from Tory politicians or from a non-existent opposition led by Starmer, an opposition which has failed to put forward any serious views on anything. Boris Johnson may fib and lie. Starmer does nothing except back him when wars are to be fought. And I have to say this, as having been an opponent of wars for a long time, that I am really upset and angry that left-wing MPs in Parliament capitulated to Starmer and withdrew their names from the petitions denouncing war. Where will this all end? As for what is happening in the Ukraine itself, let's just discuss very briefly where it could end. It is not going to end if the war is aggravated and if people who have no idea what war means demand no-fly zones. Today there have been some form of negotiations being carried out. Now listen to this irony, that the politician who is accepted by Putin and Zelensky as an honest mediator, a democratic mediator, is the Prime Minister of Israel. What advice can he give them? Do to the Ukrainians like we do to the Palestinians? Set up a puppet government? That's the only advice this particular mediator is capable of giving them. But we have to demand further. We do not want to see, this is not just about regime change. This is actually about disappearing a country. And what we have to demand is that some remnant of an independent Ukraine persists. Biden and NATO were prepared to let Putin take the Donbass, take those states. Well, if you say that, then he'll say we have more states where there are Russian populations, where our people are being stopped from speaking Russian. And that is what he is saying. So the way to end this wretched conflict, this disaster, is a negotiated settlement, a peace settlement that attempts to preserve something. Otherwise, it's just living in cloud cuckoo land to think that we can have a nuclear war in this crisis and in this situation. And one last word about the British media. I tend not to watch it, I have to be honest with you, or read it. But I had to use the lavatory in Charing Cross Station. And I passed by the newspaper shop and just to look at the headlines of the British press today. It is warmongering on an insane level. And this warmongering, the reason for this warmongering is that in reality they can do nothing. This notion of Johnson saying 6 points, standing before a picture of Thatcher during the Falklands War, when neither the Falklands War could have been won without Americans and Pinochet, and in this war, the decisions are not made by any sort of democratic so-called NATO high command. They are made in Washington by the White House and the Pentagon. Britain and the NATO countries in Europe have no say in how this war will brought to be an end, because we live not in a rules-based order, we live in a US rules-based order. They make the rules, they call the shots, they take the decisions, and NATO is nothing less or more than a US-led military alliance designed to keep Europe under control. So we fight on. We fight on against Putin, against NATO, and solidarity not just with the Russian marchers, solidarity with the Italians in Naples and Milan who marched outside NATO bases. Stop the war must spread to the whole of Europe, not exist just in Britain.
Thanks very much indeed, Sophie, and hello, everybody. I have to say that I feel proud and humbled to be able to read this statement that has come from the Ukrainian peace movement. It comes from Yuri Shelyazenko, who lives in Kyiv, and he sent us this statement last night, and I hope that today he is safe and well. He says, "Dear friends in the UK, our movement is grateful to CND and all the peace groups for your tireless rallying to stop the war in Ukraine and to stop NATO expansion. Ukrainian pacifists are living in cities under Russian bombardment, which have already killed over 2,000 civilians, including children. We believe this brutal invasion should be stopped, but we strongly oppose reckless demands to close the sky. We call Russia to stop military operations in and around Ukraine and negotiate in good faith for sustainable peace. The same call we address to the government of Ukraine and all NATO countries, including the UK. We call Ukrainian officials to respect non-proliferation obligations and to stop speculations about regaining nuclear weapons. We call for solidarity of global civil society in seeking non-violent solutions to the current crisis. We hope that with the help of all people in the world, speaking truth to power, condemning war profiteering, demanding to stop shooting and start talking, aiding those who need it, especially conscientious objectors to military service and other vulnerable groups, and investing into peace culture and education for non-violent citizenship. In doing this, we could together build a better world without armies and without borders. A world where truth and love are the great powers, embracing East and West. And I want to send a strong message from this protest back to Yuri and all those fighting for peace in Ukraine and those courageous protesters across Russia who are also facing arrest and imprisonment for speaking out for peace. That message of peace and hope from Yuri is indeed a powerful one, not least because he raises the spectre of nuclear war. And we know that if this war continues to escalate, then nuclear weapons are on the agenda. And we know, as Yuri says, if those calls to close the sky, to create that no-fly zone are followed through, then as sure as night follows day, we will see war between NATO and Russia. And a war between NATO and Russia puts 12,000 nuclear weapons into this war framework. We do not want to see a nuclear war because we can be certain not only will Ukraine suffer and the people of Ukraine, but every single person on this planet will suffer if we enter into nuclear war. One nuclear weapon dropped here on Trafalgar Square will not only obliterate central London, it will obliterate the entire framework and infrastructure of London. Millions of people will die, millions of people will be injured and suffer from radiation. Indeed, the radiation cloud, which will poison life, create cancers, birth deformities, and terrible illnesses, just from one nuclear weapon on the centre of London, will reach out as far as Norwich, Norfolk, the coast, the North Sea, everywhere around London. This is not some fantasy of CND, which we've been warning for decades. This is a real possibility today. If you want yourself, your children, your grandchildren to have a future, we must stop nuclear war. Do everything you can for peace. Thank you.
Student movement. We at NUS in the UK, we share the sorrow, the deep concern that all of us feel that brings all of us here today. The displacement of and violence faced by the Ukrainian people during this time is and will continue to be great, and the actions taken by Russia are inexcusable. There is no justification for violence. There is no justification for war. And we condemn these acts of aggression. At NUS UK, we are founding members of the European Students' Union, and just as students always have, we too today believe that collectively, through peace and solidarity, we can build a world rooted in peace, justice and liberation. And in that spirit, I now read to you words written by the European Students' Union, the Global Students' Forum, and the Ukrainian Association of Students. As the shadows of war in Eastern Europe gather, For the first time since 1945, with a potential general escalation, the Global Student Forum, the European Students' Union, and the Ukrainian Association of Students makes a twofold appeal. As students from all over Europe and across the world, we hope that our organizations commit themselves to peace, détente, and serious pacification. Recognizing the right to study as a human right means protecting a context in which people can freely develop their possibilities, departing from an equal standing point, without the threat of armed confrontation endangering education, lives, and livelihoods. A clash which once again takes place starting from an ethno-nationalist basis for the defense of spheres of power and influence. Now, we mention this basis, we mention this intention, because this ethno-nationalist basis in the actions of powers that be, seeking to extend and overreach spheres of power and influence, these intentions show us once again that nothing peaceful, nothing positive ever comes from borders or war. I say it again, nothing peaceful, nothing positive ever comes from borders or war. Now, there are many who seek to push the narrative that to challenge NATO is to justify the atrocities taking place, and we know that that is untrue. We know that war is not inevitable. We know that harm is not inevitable. We know that injustice is not inevitable. And we are fighting for a world where Ukrainians and all those whose lives have been tarnished by war and violence can be free. And this violence extends beyond what we're seeing day to day. It extends beyond the harm that Russia is enacting on Ukraine. We see too that black and brown students who are seeking safety are being blocked from that safety. And so we must remind the world once again that Black Lives Matter. And we send our solidarity to all of the black students seeking freedom and safety in Ukraine, and we will stand with them in their struggle. So we say no to war, we say no to violence, we say no to injustice, and just as the global student movement always has, we continue to build a world of peace.
Veterans for Peace condemns the invasion of Ukraine. Our mission remains the same. We are committed to a sustainable and just peace. As veterans, we know increased violence only fuels extremism. We have watched and in some cases been first-hand witnesses to how the people of Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen have had their countries and their lives destroyed by US and Russian military involvement. The only sane course of action now is a commitment to genuine diplomacy with serious negotiations, without which conflict could easily spiral out of control to the point of further pushing the world towards nuclear war. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you, every single one of you that's come here to Trafalgar Square this afternoon, and in particular to the Ukrainian people in the square, or those that have family or friends in Ukraine. Absolute solidarity and support and sympathy for all the stress and all the pressure you're going through. But I think you must be moved by the degree of support and the practical help that people all over the country are doing in terms of food and clothing and medicine. Our absolute support to you. This is one of hundreds, if not thousands, of demonstrations all around the world today calling for an end to the war in Ukraine. There can be nothing but complete condemnation of the decision taken by President Putin to launch a war against the people of Ukraine. We absolutely and totally condemn that action and what has happened as a result of it.
There can never be any justification for launching missiles against civilian targets, defenseless towns and cities, and the killing that is going on of Ukrainian soldiers, of Ukrainian civilians, and of course the loss of life of so many young Russian conscripts as well. War kills lots of people on both sides in the conflict. That's why the message of so many people across Russia, and I referred in Parliament on last week to a statement sent by socialists across Russia who are against the war, calling for an end to that war. And speaking to people in Russia by phone over the last few days, I've just picked up the bravery of what they're doing. We go to a demonstration expecting to protest and expecting to take a coffee afterwards and go home. They go to a protest and expect to be arrested and possibly imprisoned for many years as a result of turning out on a demonstration protesting about what their government is doing. And it's not as if the behavior of Putin, President Putin and his government is particularly new. Many of us have memories of the time when the British government of the day welcomed Putin here with a state coach and receptions and all that went on. A small number of us were protesting against that visit in support of the people of Chechnya, who were being bombed at that time by the same Putin-led government. And those that have happily received so much money from Russian oligarchs who stole that money from the people of the former Soviet Union on the breakup of the Soviet Union, they might care to think all the benefits that they've received from the wealth that was taken from the people of Russia on the breakup of the Soviet Union. It's corrupted our politics, corrupted our lives, and has led to a president in Russia who feels he can wage war with impunity against the people of Ukraine. Let us make the call as loud as we can. If you can have a ceasefire for humanitarian corridors, for people to be evacuated from certain cities in Ukraine, obviously it's better people are evacuated than killed, but it's so cynical. If you can agree a ceasefire to take civilians out, then agree a ceasefire to stop the war. And so now there are 1.5 million refugees from Ukraine going into Poland, Romania, Hungary, and eventually, presumably, to many other countries all across Europe. They need to be supported, they need to be welcomed, and the British government needs to abandon its appalling Borders and Nationality Bill, which would criminalise people for helping refugees, and instead hold out the hand to those that desperately need that help and that support. And I would say two other things in addition to that. I absolutely endorse the points that Larissa Kennedy just made, because in war there are huge acts of kindness and friendship and support and solidarity, amazing acts by humankind in supporting each other at times of danger. But unfortunately there are also some appalling signs as well. And I cannot be the only person in this square who was utterly shocked when I heard that African students were pushed off trains to make way for somebody else, that Indian students were denied access to cross the border into Poland and other places. We support refugees, whoever they are, wherever they are, and wherever they come from. And the British government, that has been quite rightly willing to support Ukrainian refugees in the abominable bombardment that the people of Ukraine are going through at the present time. Sadly, it's not the only war that's taking place at this moment. The bombing of Yemen is continuing with British weapons supplied to Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen. Those people also need an end to that conflict. They also need a place of safety. Those refugees also need to be welcomed, and indeed others that are under occupation around the world. So I simply say this in conclusion to this rally. Thank you, everyone, for standing up. Don't be quiet, don't be silent, don't stay home. Make your voice heard. We need an end to this war because, as Kate so brilliantly pointed out, unless this war is stopped very quickly, it will degenerate into a global conflict between nuclear-armed power blocks in which there will be no winners, only millions and millions of losers. And so when we stop the war in Ukraine, let's go forward to the global ban on nuclear weapons. Let's go forward to a peace agreement that gives peace and real security, which of course is homes, food, is bread, is education. That's what real security is. And end this conflict now. Peace, please, now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you everyone who's come out today to take to the streets. Don't forget that on Saturday there will be another day of action against the war in Ukraine, so watch out for what's taking place, and please get involved. As Jeremy said, don't stay silent, don't stay at home. As you do leave today, there will be people collecting. They've got buckets. If you've got loose change, please give us some, because it will help us organise future demonstrations and future actions against this horrific war.
And just finally, I'd please encourage everybody to, if you're not already, please join Stop the War. Please join the campaign for nuclear disarmament. We need you more now than ever before. We will not be silenced by warmongers and racists like Boris Johnson. We will stand firm for peace, against war and against nuclear weapons. Thank you so much for coming.